The sky over the Nebraska plains was tinged with golden hues as dusk fell, covering the dry fields of victory with a light that seemed to hide, beneath its beauty, a silent and painful reality. Sarah Miller, 32 hard years etched on her, sun-weathered face, stood at the cement sink in the kitchen of the main house of Willow Creek Ranch. Her rough, cracked fingers moved mechanically over the dirty dinner plates, while her brown eyes, distant as horizons, lost themselves in the landscape beyond the window. "Woman, where's my coffee?" Frank's voice traveled through the walls of the living room like dry thunder, making her shudder. Sarah wiped her hands on her faded apron and hurried to prepare the strong coffee that her husband demanded every afternoon. Her movements were calculated, silent, as if any noise might awaken a storm. Willow Creek Ranch, a family inheritance that Frank brandished like a trophy, stretched for acres of land punished by drought. The poorly plastered farmhouse, with its crooked windows and creaking floorboards, held stories that the walls dared not tell. The distance to victory was considerable, the access difficult through dirt roads that turned to mud during rare rains, isolating that forgotten piece of the world even further. "What's taking so long?" The chair scraped against the floor, and heavy footsteps announced that Frank's patience, always short, was wearing thin. "It's ready, Frank," replied Sarah, her voice almost a whisper, as she served the coffee in his favorite dented aluminum mug. He took the mug with thick, calloused fingers hardened by fieldwork, staring at her with those eyes that always seemed to accuse her of some uncommitted crime. Sarah lowered her gaze, as she had learned to do in 7 years of marriage. "I'm going to town tomorrow. Need to sort some things out with Mr. Harrison at the bank," he said, sipping his coffee. "And you stay here, taking proper care of the house. No gossiping with that busybody Mrs. Thompson, understand?" Sarah nodded silently. Frank needn't worry about visitors. The few neighbors in the area kept their distance, accustomed to the man's reputation and her obedient silence. The rare appearances of Mrs. Thompson, wife of one of the ranch's temporary workers, were like water droplets in a desert. When Frank finally went out to the porch, Sarah breathed in relief, allowing herself a few moments of peace. That's when she heard the familiar sound of hooves against the packed dirt ground. A shy smile, as rare as rain in August, appeared on her lips. "Moses," she called softly, going to the back door. The dark grey goat approached, wiggling its snout with curiosity. It wasn't just any animal. A gift from her late father, Moses, had been with her longer than her marriage itself. His yellowish eyes seemed to see beyond appearances, understanding what no one else perceived. Sarah crouched down and stroked the animal's rough coat, feeling the comforting warmth emanating from him. Moses pressed his snout against her face in a silent caress, as if to say he was there, that he would always be there. "What would I do without you, my friend?" she murmured, feeling her throat tighten. On the horizon, the sun began to set, stretching the shadows of cacti and mesquite trees across the ground. Sarah observed the transformation of the sky, from golden to intense red, then to deep purple, while caressing the goat. That moment, that small freedom, was all she had. "Sarah!" Frank's shout tore her from her brief moment of peace. "Bring more coffee!" Moses seemed to sense the immediate change in the woman's posture. He positioned himself between her and the door, as if forming a protective barrier. It was always like this. In moments when Frank approached with a threatening tone, the goat would strategically position itself, making the man hesitate for precious seconds. "Coming, Frank," she responded, reluctantly moving away from the animal. Upon entering the kitchen again, Sarah felt the weight of reality fall on her shoulders. The suffocating routine, the days that repeated themselves, the nights laden with uncertainty. But there was something different in the air, a restlessness she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was just the wind announcing a change in weather. Perhaps it was something more. That night, when all sounds from the ranch were reduced to the croaking of frogs in the pond and the distant singing of an owl, Sarah observed the full moon through the bedroom window. So free, so distant. She turned on the hard bed, avoiding contact with Frank's body as he snored heavily beside her. In silence, she made a prayer that even she didn't know to whom she was directing. A prayer for change, for liberation. Without knowing it, Sarah was about to find answers to questions she hadn't yet asked. Rain fell in thick curtains of water over Willow Creek Ranch, a phenomenon so rare in that region that it seemed like a miracle. Sarah watched the tea. Drops streamed down the kitchen window as she prepared lunch. Frank had left for town early in the morning, grumbling about business at the bank and predicting that he would return only the next day if the rain didn't ruin the roads. "Looks like we have a day to ourselves." "Moses," Sarah commented to the goat, which, contrary to all animal habits, preferred her company to the dry shelter of the stable. The animal, sitting near the kitchen door, flicked his ears as if understanding every word. His yellow eyes, fixed on her, conveyed an unusual intelligence. Sarah always wondered if her father had noticed this special characteristic when he gave her the kid as a gift, weeks before his unexpected departure. With Frank away, the house breathed differently. The air seemed lighter, the rooms less oppressive. Sarah allowed herself the luxury of humming softly a song her mother used to sing, a habit that Frank had suppressed early in their marriage, claiming that a decent woman doesn't show off, not even at home. When the rain intensified, accompanied by thunderclaps that made the old roof tiles tremble, Sarah remembered the tools Frank had left on the porch. He would be furious if he found everything rusty upon his return. "I'm going to store the tools in the barn, Moses. Stay here," she said, covering her head with a piece of tarp. But the goat, as always, disobeyed. When Sarah crossed the soaked yard toward the old barn at the back of the property, Moses followed closely, his hooves sinking into the mud. The barn was an old wooden structure that served as storage for tools, feed sacks, and bales of dry hay. Sarah rarely entered there. That was Frank's territory, like almost everything on the ranch. She pushed the heavy door that creaked on rusty hinges and lit the kerosene lamp that hung at the entrance. The yellowish light revealed the dusty interior. Moses entered right behind her, shaking himself and scattering water droplets across the packed earth floor. Sarah set the wet tools on an improvised workbench and was about to leave when a particularly strong crash made the barn roof vibrate. A broken tile allowed water to trickle down, forming a puddle near the back wall. "I need to fix this before Frank gets back," she murmured, looking for something she could use to contain the leak. It was at that moment that she noticed. The accumulated water had softened the soil next to the wall, revealing what appeared to be a loose board. Sarah approached, curious. With trembling fingers, she pulled the aged wood, which yielded with surprising ease, as if it had been removed many times before. Behind the board was a small hiding place dug into the earth. Sarah felt her heart race when her fingers touched something wrapped in a worn piece of cloth. Carefully, she removed the package. Moses approached, sniffing the object with interest as if he too sensed the importance of this discovery. Sarah untied the knot in the cloth with trembling fingers, revealing a letter yellowed by time and some faded banknotes. In the lamp's weak light, she unfolded the paper. The handwriting was shaky, the words apparently written in haste. "If you found this letter, it means I managed to hide it, or that he—" The sentence remained incomplete. As if the writer had been interrupted. Further down, it continued, "My name is Marlene. I'm trying to escape. I'm afraid of being found. He always ends up finding me. If you're the one reading this, be smarter than I was. Don't trust anyone in the area. The money may not be much, but maybe it will help you get further than I managed." Sarah reread the letter several times, feeling a chill run down her spine. Marlene, who was she? What had happened? And more importantly, what was her connection to Frank or to Willow Creek Ranch? A particularly loud thunderclap brought her back to reality. Quickly, she folded the letter and tucked it along with the money into her dress. Her pocket. She replaced the board, covering it with soil to disguise it, and took an old bucket to position under the roof leak. "Come on, Moses," she whispered, feeling a lump in her throat. "We need to get back before the rain gets worse." On the way back to the house under the relentless rain, Sarah felt the weight of the letter in her pocket as if she were carrying a stone. Years of submission and fear had shaped her instincts. She knew that discovering one of Frank's secrets was dangerous. But something in that letter, in that cry for help from an unknown woman, had planted a seed in her chest. That night, alone in her bed as the storm battered the roof of the main house, Sarah took the letter from its improvised hiding place in the mattress seam and reread the words by candlelight. Moses, lying at the foot of the bed as he always did in Frank's absence, watched her intently. "Who are you, Marlene?" Sarah murmured, tracing the letters with her fingertips. "And what happened?" "To you?" The last line of the letter reverberated in her mind like an echo. "Be smarter than I was." Those words, written by unknown hands, seemed directed straight at her, like a warning, advice. Or perhaps, thought Sarah, as the candlelight cast restless shadows across the walls, like a chance. The wind howled through the gaps in the poorly sealed windows, but for the first time in many years, Sarah felt something different from the habitual fear. It was a strange sensation, almost forgotten. It took a few moments to recognize it. Hope. The days following the discovery of the letter brought a subtle yet profound change in Sarah. While her hands continued to perform daily tasks, cooking, cleaning, washing, obeying, her mind worked. Tirelessly, like an underground river that flows invisibly yet constantly. Frank returned from town in a bad mood, complaining about the muddy roads and the bank that made his business difficult. Sarah received him as always, head down, meek, voice elusive eyes. But something had changed. Each harsh word, each accusing look, each abrupt gesture from her husband was now observed with new eyes, the eyes of someone who begins to see patterns where before she saw only fatality. "Why are you looking at me?" "Like that woman?" Frank questioned one night, catching her off guard. "It's nothing, Frank, just tired," she replied, quickly lowering her gaze to her plate. "Tired of what? Of idling all day in this house while I work myself to death?" His tone rose, as always happened, when he drank the moonshine he brought from town. Sarah swallowed hard, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest. Moses, who was resting in the corner of the porch, immediately stood up, approaching the kitchen door. The goat seemed to sense the tension in the air, predicting danger even before it fully manifested itself. "I'll clean up the kitchen," Sarah murmured, standing to remove the plates. "I'm not done talking, woman." The slap came quickly, accurately, making her stagger. Sarah steadied herself on the edge of the table, her face burning, ears ringing. It wasn't the first time, nor would it be the last. But something different happened then. Instead of the contained crying, the habitual resignation, an image appeared clearly in her mind. Marlene's letter, those words written in desperation, that disguised plea for advice. "Be smarter than I was." Before Frank could advance again, Moses burst into the kitchen, placing himself between the two. The animal stared at the man with those penetrating yellow eyes, its body tense, ready to defend. It wasn't the first time the goat had intervened, but never so directly, so defiantly. "Get this beast out of here before I decide to make barbecue out of it." Frank vociferated, hesitating for a moment, faced with the animal's posture. Sarah took advantage of the moment to move away, taking Moses outside. "Thank you, friend," she whispered to the goat when they were out of Frank's earshot. The animal pressed his snout against her hand as if understanding. That night, lying beside her husband, who now snored heavily, Sarah made a decision. She would not be like Marlene, whoever she may have been. She would be smarter. She would be patient. She would observe. She would plan. And most importantly, she would act. The following days inaugurated a new secret routine. During the execution of habitual tasks, Sarah began to observe and mentally record Frank's schedules, his comings and goings, the people he talked to in the rare moments when the rural telephone rang, the places where he kept money, important documents, and even the key to the old pickup truck. Taking advantage of her husband's absences, she carefully searched the house, looking for any indication about Marlene. In the dusty drawer of a dresser in the never-used guest room, she found an old photograph, a young woman with a shy smile next to a younger and less hardened Frank. Turning the photograph over, she read the faded inscription, "Frank and Marlene, 1988. "So you really existed," Sarah murmured, feeling a shiver upon confirming that the letter was not a delusion or invention. With redoubled caution, she began to gather small provisions, hiding them in strategic locations. A banknote here, an important document there, essential items that would not be immediately missed, but could be crucial in a moment of need. Mrs. Miller. Mrs. Thompson's voice, coming from the yard, interrupted her thoughts one afternoon. Sarah hurried to hide the small package she was preparing inside the lining of an old dress. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Thompson," she greeted, going out to meet the neighbor. The older woman, her face marked by the sun and hands calloused by work in the fields, carried a small basket covered by an embroidered cloth. "I brought some fresh eggs from my hens. I know yours aren't laying right with this drought." "You didn't have to trouble yourself," Sarah thanked her, genuinely touched by the gesture. Mrs. Thompson looked around, making sure they were alone before lowering her voice. "I saw Mr. Miller heading toward Riverdale. Seems he'll be there for a few days, sorting out land business." Sarah nodded, keeping her face impassive. Internally, however, her heart raced. Days. She would have entire days without Frank's oppressive presence. "I also came to tell you there's a woman from the county office visiting farms around here. Some kind of social worker," continued Mrs. Thompson, adjusting the scarf that covered her graying hair. "She's doing a survey," she said. "Should pass by here tomorrow or the day after." "Social worker?" Sarah frowned. It was rare for government services to reach this forgotten corner of the world. "Yes, dear. Take advantage of being alone and talk to her. Sometimes we need to speak with someone from outside, you know?" There was something in Mrs. Thompson's look, a silent knowledge, an unspoken understanding that made Sarah wonder how much the neighbor really knew about what happened behind the walls of Willow Creek Ranch. After Mrs. Thompson left, Sarah sat on the porch, absently caressing Moses's ears as he rested his head in her lap. The information about the social worker circled her mind like a persistent fly. Coincidence? Maybe. Opportunity? Possibly. Dusk. Contemplating the sky that was tinged red and orange, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Expectation. It wasn't exactly hope. That emotion seemed too grand for what she felt. It was something more modest, more cautious. A small seed of possibility planted in soil long dried up by fear. Moses, as if sensing his owner's internal agitation, raised his head and stared at her with those wise ancient eyes. Sarah smiled at the animal, her only confidant. "Tomorrow might be a different day, Moses, and we need to be prepared." The sun was already high when Sarah heard the sound of a car approaching on the dirt road that led to Willow Creek Ranch. The unusual sound made her interrupt her work of hanging clothes on the improvised clothesline behind the house. Moses, who was grazing peacefully nearby, raised his head, ears alert to the unfamiliar noise. A small vehicle, covered with the red dust characteristic of the region, parked in the yard. Sarah watched, apprehensive, as a woman got out of the car. It wasn't anyone she knew, a stranger in Victory, a place where everyone had known each other for generations. The visitor appeared to be around 40, hair tied in a discreet bun, simple but well-kept clothes. She carried a folder and walked with determined steps toward the house. Sarah dried her wet hands on her apron and went to meet the stranger, Moses accompanying her like a faithful shadow. "Good afternoon. Can I help you?" she asked, maintaining a cautious distance. The woman opened a gentle smile, but her eyes quickly scanned Sarah's face, lingering for a moment on the bruise partially hidden by a lock of hair. "Good afternoon. My name is Tracy. I'm a social worker from the county office. I'm conducting a survey of rural families in the region," she introduced herself, extending a hand that Sarah timidly shook. "You must be Sarah Miller, am I right?" Sarah nodded, surprised to hear her full name, so rarely pronounced in these parts, where she was known only as Frank's wife. "May I come in for a few minutes?" "I have some forms we need to fill out," Tracy requested. "Of course," Sarah responded automatically, although an internal alarm sounded. Frank would not like this visit at all. "My husband isn't here. He went to take care of business in Riverdale." "That's not a problem. Actually, the survey should preferably be conducted with the women of the house. They usually know the family's needs better," explained Tracy with a smile that didn't quite reach her attentive eyes. In the kitchen, Sarah offered coffee and a piece of cornbread she had baked that morning. Tracy accepted politely, arranging her papers on the rustic table. Moses, contrary to his usual distrustful behavior with strangers, lay down near the visitor, as if approving of her. "Interesting animal you have," Tracy commented, observing the goat. "Seems more like a guard dog than a goat." "He was a gift. From my father," Sarah responded, allowing herself a small smile. "Sometimes I think he understands everything that happens around him." The questions started simple. How many people lived in the house, how long they had been there, if they had access to basic health and education services. Sarah answered mechanically, her voice low, her eyes frequently glancing at the window as if fearing Frank's unexpected arrival. "Mrs. Miller, there are no right or wrong answers here," Tracy said gently, using the married surname that Sarah had almost forgotten was hers. "Everything we discuss stays between us." Something in the way the social worker said those words made Sarah raise her eyes. There was an intensity in the woman's gaze, a purpose. That seemed to go beyond the simple filling out of government forms. "Does your husband spend a lot of time away from home?" Tracy asked, subtly changing the tone of the conversation. "Sometimes," Sarah answered cautiously, "when he needs to. Take care of business." "And what is life like when he's at home?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Sarah felt her throat tighten. That wasn't a standard form question. Her eyes met Tracy's, who watched her with an expression that mixed patience and knowledge. "Normal," she finally answered, the word sounding false even to her own ears. Tracy nodded, without pressing. Instead, she continued filling out the form, while speaking in a casual tone. "You know, it's not uncommon for us to find women in complicated situations during our fieldwork. People who need help, but don't know how to ask, or are afraid to ask." Sarah remained silent, hands clasped. In her lap under the table, Moses approached her, pressing his snout against her leg as he always did when he sensed she was distressed. "That's why we created the support network," Tracy continued, without looking directly at Sarah, as if talking about the weather. A system for those who need to get out of difficult situations that seem to have no way out." Sarah's heart raced. There was something between the lines of that seemingly banal conversation that made her instinct awaken. The same sensation she had when finding Marlene's letter, a mixture of fear and hope. "What kind of help?" she finally asked, her voice almost inaudible. Tracy looked up from the form, her gaze meeting Sarah's with an intensity that communicated much more than words could. "All kinds of help, Mrs. Miller. Shelter, protection, a new beginning." With a smooth movement, Tracy lightly touched Sarah's arm and, as she withdrew her hand, discreetly dropped something onto the porch bench, a small card that Sarah quickly covered with the palm of her hand. "I think I have all the necessary information now," said the social worker, gathering her papers. "Thank you very much for your time and hospitality." When Tracy was about to leave, she turned back one last time. "If you need anything, any information about government social programs, don't hesitate to contact the office in town or call the number I left on the form." Sarah accompanied her to the car, watching the vehicle move away on the dirt road, raising dust. When she was sure she was alone again, she retrieved the hidden card and read with a racing heart, "Marlene's Shelter House, Support for Women," followed by a phone number. Marlene. The same name from the letter. The coincidence was impossible. The sun was beginning to set when Sarah stored the card in the same hiding place where she kept the letter, behind a loose floorboard in the bedroom. Her mind was buzzing with questions. Who was this Tracy, really? How did she know about Marlene? Was it a trap set by Frank to test her loyalty? Doubt consumed her, but a certainty grew in her chest. Something had been set in motion that day, something that could not be ignored or forgotten. Moses, lying near the bedroom door, watched her with those wise, ancient eyes. In the silence of Willow Creek Ranch, as the first stars appeared in the plain sky, Sarah made another decision. She needed to find out more about Marlene before taking the next step, and she knew exactly who to start with. Mrs. Thompson, the only person in the area who didn't seem to fear Frank. Dawn arrived with suffocating heat, typical of that region during the drought. Sarah rose before the sun had fully risen, determined to take advantage of every minute of Frank's absence. She prepared strong coffee, separated some cornmeal cookies in a cloth wrap, and set off toward Mrs. Thompson's small property, about a half-hour walk away. "Stay here, Moses," she ordered the goat, who, as usual, was preparing to follow her. "I need you to watch the house." For the first time, the animal seemed reluctant to obey her. He positioned himself in her path, shaking his head as if protesting. "I promise I'll be back soon," Sarah whispered, caressing the goat's snout. "Trust me." The path to Mrs. Thompson's house meandered between small planted fields and scrubland areas, the already scorching sun making the walk arduous. Sarah, however, felt a strange energy propelling her steps. Each meter traveled away from Willow. Creek Ranch was like a small act of rebellion, a silent affirmation of a long-dormant independence. Mrs. Thompson's property was modest but welcoming. A simple brick house painted light blue, surrounded by a small orchard of peach and apple trees that bravely survived the drought. The yard, swept and clean, revealed the owner's meticulousness. "Sarah, what a nice surprise!" exclaimed Mrs. Thompson upon seeing her arrive, her wrinkled face opening into a genuine smile. "Come in, dear, it's coffee time." Sarah felt immediately welcomed by the neighbors' warm simplicity. Mrs. Thompson's kitchen, although small, was an invitation to comfort with its wood stove lit, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and biscuits baking. "I brought some cookies," Sarah offered timidly. "How kind." "I'll put them on the table. Sit down, child. Today you have a different look. And did something happen?" inquired the lady, serving 2 cups of steaming coffee. Sarah hesitated, stirring the spoon in her coffee without really drinking it. She had mentally rehearsed this conversation during the entire walk, but now the words seemed to escape her. "Did you get a visit from the county woman?" asked Mrs. Thompson, providing an opening that Sarah promptly seized. "Yes, I did. Just yesterday," she responded, carefully observing the neighbor's reaction. "Someone named Tracy." Mrs. Thompson nodded, sipping her coffee calmly. There was something in her eyes, an ancient wisdom that seemed to evaluate each word before pronouncing, "Tos, and what did you think of her?" Sarah took courage. "I thought it was strange that she gave me a card using for a place called Marlene's Shelter House." The name hung in the air like smoke. Mrs. Thompson remained motionless for a few seconds, her aged face assuming a grave expression that Sarah had never seen before. "So, the time has finally come," murmured the lady, more to herself than to Sarah. She stood up, checked through the window to make sure they were really alone, and sat down again, now closer. "This Tracy, she's not from the county office, my child." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. "Who is she then?" "Someone who helps women escape. Women like you." Mrs. Thompson made a significant pause. "And like Marlene was one day." Sarah's heart accelerated. "You knew Marlene?" she asked, leaning forward, almost knocking over her coffee cup. "I did. She was Frank's first wife," confessed Mrs. Thompson, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "A pretty girl, soft-spoken, who came from the coast. She didn't last even 2 years on that ranch." Sarah felt a knot form in her throat. "What happened to her?" Mrs. Thompson sighed deeply, as if the weight of that story were physical, palpable. "Nobody. So knows for sure. One day she simply disappeared. Frank said she had run off with a trucker who was passing through these parts, but nobody ever really believed that story." "Why not?" "Because Marlene wasn't like that. She was quiet, shy even, and she was afraid, very afraid." Mrs. Thompson paused, her eyes fixed on some distant point as if seeing the past. "Just like you when you arrived here." Sarah felt tears welling up, but she contained them. It was not the moment to weaken. "Do you think that he—" "I don't know, child. And it's better for no one to know or think about it," Mrs. Thompson cut in, her tone suddenly harder. "What I know is that after she disappeared, Frank changed, became more closed off, more controlling. When he brought you, 3 years later, Many people commented on the similarity, not in appearance but in manner. Sarah breathed deeply, trying to digest all that information. So the letter was real. Marlene had existed, and apparently had met an uncertain fate after trying to escape. This shelter house? Sarah began cautiously. Why does it have her name? Mrs. Thompson smiled slightly, a sad smile. It was founded by women who managed to escape from situations like hers. And yours, she explained. The name is a tribute and a reminder. You know this place? I do. I've helped some to get there, confessed Mrs. Thompson, including I was the one who asked Tracy to come see you. The revelation hit Sarah like a bucket of cold water. So it hadn't been a coincidence. Mrs. Thompson had observed, known, understood, and had acted. Why? Asked Sarah, her voice choked. Because nobody deserves to live in fear, child. Nobody deserves to have their soul suffocated day after day, responded the lady, covering Sarah's hand with her own, calloused by years of hard work. And also because I promised myself I wouldn't close my eyes again, not after Marlene. Sarah let a tear silently roll down. I'm afraid, she finally confessed. Of course you are. You'd be a fool if you weren't, Mrs. Thompson responded frankly. But you have to ask yourself what frightens you more, trying to change your life or continuing to live like this until the end. The words hit Sarah like a ray of clarity amidst the storm of uncertainties. What should I do, she asked, the decision already forming in her heart. You'll go back home now. You'll act normally. And you'll wait, instructed Mrs. Thompson, squeezing her hand with surprising strength for someone her age. Tracy will contact you in the next few days, when Frank leaves again. Sarah nodded, feeling a mixture of terror and determination. And if he finds out? And if it's like... With Marlene. Mrs. Thompson stood up, going to a cabinet, from which she retrieved a small package. Take this, she said, handing the package to Sarah. It's an amulet my grandmother gave me. They say it protects those who are on a journey. Sarah opened the package, revealing a small silver medal, darkened by time with symbols she didn't recognize. And there's one more thing different this time, added Mrs. Thompson, accompanying Sarah to the door. You have Moses. That goat is not an ordinary animal, my child. My late Joe always said he has a gaze that sees beyond. On the way back to Willow Creek Ranch, Sarah felt the weight of the medal in her pocket and the even heavier weight of the revelations in her chest. The sun punished mercilessly, but she barely noticed the heat. Her mind worked, processing, planning, fearing. In the distance, she distinguished Moses's silhouette, standing exactly where the trail opened into the ranch yard, as if standing, dersad, waiting for her return. Upon seeing her, the animal came to meet her, shaking his head as if reproving her for taking so long. You were right, not to want to let me go alone, Sarah murmured, embracing the goat's neck, feeling the comforting warmth of the animal. But it was something I needed to do. The sun was already high in the sky. Soon it would be time to prepare lunch, continue with the routine, as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't just turned upside down. Sarah looked one last time at Mrs. Thompson's house, barely visible in the distance before entering the ranch. A decision had been made. Now it was a matter of waiting for the right moment. Frank's return from his trip to Riverdale brought with it an even heavier atmosphere to Willow Creek Ranch. Sarah noticed the change immediately. There was something different in her husband's gaze, a latent suspicion, as if he could smell the silent transformations that had occurred in his absence. Did anyone come here while I was gone? He asked during dinner on the first night, eyes fixed on Sarah as he slowly chewed a piece of meat. Her heart accelerated, but years of practice in hiding emotions came to her rescue. She kept her gaze down, her voice controlled. Just Mrs. Thompson, who brought some eggs, and a woman from the county office doing a survey of families in the region. Frank stopped chewing, his fork suspended in the air. What county office woman? A social worker. She said it was a new government program. Sarah responded, feeling drops of cold sweat forming on the back of her neck. And what did she want to know? Frank's voice had assumed that dangerously calm tone that always preceded the worst storms. Normal things. How many people live here if we have access to a doctor, school? Sarah kept her eyes fixed on her plate, fearing her face would betray. The turmoil of emotions consuming her inside. Frank grunted something unintelligible and resumed eating. The silence that followed was oppressive, loaded with unresolved tension. Sarah could feel his gaze burning her skin even when she wasn't directly facing him. The following days transpired in an apparent routine, but Sarah felt that something had fundamentally changed in the house's dynamics. Frank rarely left the property, as if he had decided to stand guard. When he needed to go to town, he returned much earlier than usual, often catching her by surprise. On a particularly hot morning, while Sarah was hanging clothes on the line, she heard Frank's voice coming from the barn. "How much do you think he's worth, Jake?" Approaching discreetly, she saw that her husband was talking with Jake Myers, a cattle dealer from the region known for his shady business. "It's quite a specimen, Frank. Never seen a goat of this size and with this coloration. I'll give you 500 for him right now," responded the man, evaluating Moses, who was tied to a rope inside the pen. Sarah's stomach painfully contracted. Moses. Frank intended to sell Moses. "Could be. I'll think about it and let you know," responded Frank, patting the dealer's back while accompanying him to his car. As soon as the men moved away, Sarah ran to the pen. Moses, upon seeing her, shook his head, agitated. His yellow eyes seemed to communicate an urgency that transcended the barrier between humans and animals. "He won't take you away, my friend," she whispered, caressing the goat's snout. "I promise." That night, during dinner, Sarah gathered courage to approach the subject. "I saw Jake Myers here today," she commented, trying to keep her voice casual. "And I saw that he was looking at Moses." Frank chewed slowly, observing her with those eyes that seemed to see through her. "I'm thinking of selling that useless goat. Just eats and isn't good for anything." Sarah felt her heart tighten but maintained an impassive face. "He was a gift from my father." "Your father has been dead for years, woman, and that beast eats too much. Besides," Frank leaned over the table, his hot whiskey breath hitting Sarah's face, "I've noticed you give it too much attention, more than you should." The implicit threat in the words made Sarah shudder. It wasn't just about selling an animal. It was about cutting her last emotional bond, her last source of comfort and protection. "As you wish, Frank," she responded mechanically, the words leaving like ashes in her mouth. Later, alone in the bedroom while her husband drank on the porch, Sarah allowed herself to cry silently. The sale of Moses wasn't just a cruelty, it was a strategic blow. As if Frank somehow intuited her plans and was systematically removing any possibility of escape. Despair threatened to consume her when her fingers accidentally touched something in her dress pocket, the medal Mrs. Thompson had given her. "Protects those who are on a journey," she had said. Sarah squeezed the metal object tightly, as if she could extract from it the courage that was beginning to fail her. The next day, at noon, when the sun mercilessly punished the plains, the ranch's rural telephone rang. It was rare to receive calls, and Sarah answered with hesitation, conscious of Frank's gaze as he worked in the shed near the house. "Hello? Mrs. Miller? This is Tracy, from the county office." The familiar voice of the false social worker sounded from the other end of the line. "We're updating some registry data and need to confirm some information." Sarah immediately understood the coded message. "Yes, of course. How can I help?" "Could you confirm if you're available for a new visit tomorrow, around 3 in the afternoon?" asked Tracy, her professional voice hiding the true purpose of the call. Sarah looked through the window. Frank was now talking with one of the temporary workers, his back to the house. "Tomorrow won't be possible," she responded, her heart hammering against her chest. "My husband will be home." "I understand." "And Thursday?" "Thursday he's going to town to take care of bank business," responded Sarah, lowering her voice even more. "He leaves early and comes back only in the late afternoon." "Excellent. Then I'll pass by there on Thursday around 10 in the morning to finalize the documentation. Is that good for you?" "Yes, I'll be waiting." When she hung up the phone, Sarah realized her hands were trembling uncontrollably. Thursday. 2 days. 48 hours to prepare everything she needed, to make final decisions, to gather courage. 2 days to say goodbye to the life she had known for 7 years. 2 days to trace the path between captivity and freedom. On the porch, she heard the sound of Moses's hooves against the packed dirt ground. The goat watched her through the improvised fence where Frank had tied him, his amber eyes communicating a silent urgency. As if he also knew that time was running out. 2 days, Moses, she whispered to herself. 2 days and we'll be free. But first, she would have to prevent the goat's sale. And for that, she would need a plan that wouldn't arouse Frank's already latent suspicions. That night, while washing the dinner dishes, an idea began to form in her mind. A risky idea that depended as much on courage as on luck. But as Mrs. Thompson had said, it was time to decide what frightened her more, trying to change her life or continuing to live in terror until the end. With her hands submerged in soapy water and her eyes fixed on the horizon oranged by the sunset, Sarah made her choice. And for the first time in years, it wasn't the choice of fear. Wednesday dawned laden with heavy clouds, unusual for that time of year in the Nebraska plains. Sarah observed the grey sky through the kitchen window while preparing breakfast, a presage that seemed to reflect the internal storm consuming her. It was her penultimate day at Willow Creek Ranch, her penultimate day as Frank Miller's submissive wife, if everything went according to plan. "It's going to rain," commented Frank, entering the kitchen with his hair still damp from the shower. "The cattle will need to be moved to the high pasture." Sarah served him coffee in silence, discreetly observing his movements. Her husband seemed more relaxed that morning, almost cordial. This made her even more alert. Frank's rare demonstrations of good humor usually preceded the worst moments. "Jake is coming to get the goat tomorrow," he announced between sips of coffee. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine but kept her face impassive. "I thought you were still deciding," she responded. "Cautiously, I've decided. 500 is good money for an animal that just eats and doesn't produce anything." Frank stared at her, waiting for some reaction. "Any problem with that?" It was a trap, Sarah knew, a deliberate provocation to test her. She lowered her eyes to her cup, assuming the posture of submission he expected. "No, Frank, you decide what's best." A tense silence settled in the small kitchen, broken only by the sound of coffee, sips and the distant rumble of approaching thunder. "I'll need you to come with me this afternoon to Mr. Harrison's house," Frank suddenly said. "He has some papers he wants you to sign too." Sarah raised her eyes, alarmed. It was rare for Frank to take her anywhere, especially to deal with business. "What papers?" "For the ranch mortgage," he responded, with a casual tone that didn't match the seriousness of the subject. "I need more capital to expand the cattle operation, and since the property is in both our names after your father died and left his part to you, the bank wants your signature too." The mention of her father and the inheritance she had barely been able to enjoy hit Sarah like a punch. Frank rarely talked about this, about how he had manipulated the situation after old Arthur's death so that she, young and naive, would transfer half of the property rights to his name soon after their hasty marriage. "I didn't know you were thinking of mortgaging the ranch," she commented, trying to buy time to organize her thoughts. "I don't pay you to think, woman. I pay you to take care of the house and obey me," responded Frank, his initial good humor completely dissipated. "Be ready at 2, and make sure you wear decent clothes. I don't want you looking like a peasant in front of the bank manager." As soon as Frank left for the corral, Sarah felt panic grow. The trip to the bank wasn't in her plans. If they went to town that afternoon, she would lose the only chance to prepare everything for tomorrow's escape. Besides, signing mortgage papers was the last thing she wanted to do a day before leaving that place forever. With trembling hands, Sarah went to the bedroom and lifted the loose floorboard where she kept her few precious belongings. Marlene's letter, the shelter house card, Mrs. Thompson's medal, some bills saved over the years, and the personal documents she had managed to pilfer from Frank's drawer. It wasn't much, but it represented her only hope for a new beginning. The rain began to fall, first in isolated drops that soon transformed into a curtain of water. Sarah watched through the window, her mind frantically searching for a solution. That's when she saw Moses, still tied in the improvised pen, exposed to the intensifying storm. The animal looked directly at the house, as if calling to her. An idea began to form in her mind. Risky, desperate, but perhaps the only possible way out. Making sure that Frank was still busy with the cattle, Sarah ran to the pantry and took a bottle of cough syrup that she kept for emergencies. It was a strong medication that always made her drowsy. She hesitated for a moment, the bottle in her hands, the weight of the decision almost suffocating her. It's the only way, she thought, pouring a generous amount of the syrup into the thermos where Frank kept his coffee to take to work in the field. Next, she took an old umbrella and headed to the pen where Moses was. The goat received her with a movement of his head, his eyes fixed on hers as if understanding the gravity of the moment. "I need your help, my friend," she whispered, untying the rope that bound the animal, "more than ever." As the afternoon approached, the rain intensified, transforming the ranch yard into a mud pit and the paths into improvised streams. Frank returned from the field soaked and ill-tempered, taking large gulps of coffee from the thermos. "This damn rain is going to ruin the roads," he complained, removing his muddy boots. "But there's still time to get to town before the bank closes." Sarah, who had already prepared a bundle with clothes under the pretext of getting ready for the visit to the bank, nodded in silence. She discreetly observed each of Frank's movements, noting how his eyes were beginning to grow heavy, how his sentences became increasingly drawn out. "I'm feeling strange," he said, passing his hand over his forehead. "Must be this change in weather." "Why don't you lie down a bit before we go?" suggested Sarah, maintaining a solicitous tone. "We still have time." Frank didn't usually accept suggestions, especially from her, but the effect of the syrup was already too evident for him to resist. He stumbled to the bedroom and collapsed on the bed, falling asleep almost instantly. Sarah waited a few minutes, monitoring his heavy breathing before acting. With quick and silent movements, she gathered the belongings she had separated and hidden. She changed from the dress to pants and a blouse more suitable for the journey ahead, and put on the rain boots that Frank forced her to wear during garden work. Moses waited on the porch, as if understanding that this was the moment. The rain continued heavily, transforming the path to the main road into a challenge. Sarah knew they would have only a few hours before Frank awoke, confused and furious. A few hours to travel miles of muddy road, find a safe shelter, disappear. She cast a last look at the house. That had been her prison for 7 years. There was no nostalgia, just a strange emptiness that would soon be filled with fear or hope, depending on the success of her escape. "Let's go, Moses," she whispered, caressing the goat's snout. "Our path is long." And under the dense curtain of rain that fell mercilessly on the plains, Sarah took the first step toward freedom, with Moses at her side like a silent guardian. Mrs. Thompson's medal weighed in her pocket, a constant reminder of the promise of protection during the journey. What Sarah didn't imagine was that the true test of her courage was yet to come, waiting for her at the bend of the river they would need to cross to reach the road that led to town. A normally gentle river, but which the intense rain had transformed into a furious and treacherous torrent. And it was there, between the past that imprisoned her and the uncertain future that awaited her, that Sarah would face the definitive test of her determination. The rain fell mercilessly, transforming the world around Sarah into a grey blur of water and mud. Each step was a struggle against the ground that gave way beneath her feet, against the wind that whipped her face, against the fear that threatened to paralyze her at any moment. Moses walked ahead, his hooves seeming to instinctively find the safest path through that liquid chaos. "We need to reach the river before the rain gets worse, Moses," Sarah murmured, more to herself than to the goat. The path that led to the Blackwater River, normally a well-defined trail between shrubs and rocks, had been transformed into a muddy stream. Sarah calculated they would have at most 2 hours before Frank awoke from the syrup-induced sleep. 2 hours to cross the river, reach the main road, and with luck find some transportation that would take them far from there. The small bundle of belongings she carried was already soaked, weighing on her shoulders like an anchor. But the heaviest load was invisible. The fear of being caught, the uncertainty of the future, the doubt about her own courage. When she finally sighted the river, Sarah felt her heart sink. What was normally a tranquil waterway, which in times of drought would reveal its rocky bed, was now a furious torrent of muddy water that roared with frightening force. The banks had disappeared under the flood, and trunks uprooted by the force of the current danced dangerously on the turbulent surface. "My God," she whispered, paralyzed before the obstacle that seemed insurmountable. Moses approached the bank, assessing the situation with those yellow eyes that seemed to see beyond the obvious. The animal backed up a few steps, shaking his head as if denying the possibility of crossing there. The storm intensified, lightning cutting the sky, prematurely darkened by the rain. Sarah felt despair grow. Going back wasn't an option. Moving forward seemed impossible. She was trapped between two dangers, both potentially fatal. That's when she noticed, through the curtain of rain, a weak and trembling light on the opposite bank of the river. A flashlight, perhaps, or a lantern. Someone was there on the other side, as if waiting. "There's someone there, Moses," she said, her voice barely rising above the noise of the storm. The goat fixed his gaze on the distant light, ears alert. Then, to Sarah's amazement, he began to move to the right, following the riverbank. She hesitated for just an instant before following him, trusting the instinct of the animal that had never failed her. After about 200 yards, Moses stopped. There, the river made a gentle curve, forming a small cove where the current seemed less violent, and miraculously a tree trunk had fallen, forming a precarious bridge over the turbulent waters. "It's too risky," Sarah murmured, evaluating the slippery trunk. But when she looked again at the other bank, she saw that the light had come closer. Now she could vaguely distinguish the outline of a human figure holding what appeared to be a lantern. Time was running out. The choice was to cross or face Frank's fury when he awoke. "Let's try," she decided, approaching the fallen trunk. Moses, however, had other plans. The goat gently pushed her aside with his snout and was the first to climb onto the improvised trunk. His hooves moved with surprising firmness over the slippery surface as he slowly advanced. "Moses, wait!" Sarah called, fearing for the animal's safety. But the goat continued, carefully testing each step. Upon reaching the middle of the trunk, he stopped and looked back as if calling her to follow his example. Sarah took a deep breath and began the crossing. The trunk oscillated slightly under her weight, the wet wood offering little grip for her feet. She advanced inch by inch, clinging to small branches that still remained, feeling her heart hammer against her chest with each movement. When she reached the point where Moses waited, the goat surprised her again. Instead of continuing to advance, he positioned himself sideways on the trunk, creating a kind of barrier between Sarah and the threatening void of the turbulent river below. It was as if he were offering his body as a living handrail for her to support herself during the crossing. "You really are amazing," she murmured, moved by the animal's intelligence and loyalty. Leaning slightly on Moses, Sarah continued the crossing step by step. The roar of the waters below seemed to want to swallow her. The rain made it difficult to see, but the goat's firm presence at her side gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. When she finally reached the other bank, she almost collapsed, from exhaustion and relief. Moses nimbly jumped to firm ground right after her, shaking himself to get rid of the water accumulated in his coat. "Sarah?" The female voice made her raise her head. Before her stood Tracy, the false social worker, holding a lantern that projected a circle of yellowish light in the darkness of the storm. How did you know I would come today?" asked Sarah, still breathless from the crossing. "Mrs. Thompson," responded Tracy with a gentle smile. "She saw Frank buying syrup at the store yesterday and suspected. She sent a boy to warn that you might try to escape today instead of tomorrow." Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for the neighbor who, even at a distance, continued to protect her. "We have to go," Tracy urged. "There's a car waiting on the main road. If we're quick, we'll reach the shelter house before dawn." Sarah nodded, following the woman along the muddy trail. Moses accompanied them closely, his vigilant eyes scanning the darkness around them. The rain finally began to diminish, as if its purpose of facilitating the escape had already been fulfilled. "Did she make it?" Sarah suddenly asked, making Tracy stop and turn around. "Marlene, did she reach the shelter house?" A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the sound of rain on the leaves. "No," Tracy finally answered. "Marlene never reached us, but her letter did." "How?" Months after her disappearance, Mrs. Thompson found the letter hidden in the barn. She sent it to a women's support organization in Charleston. "That's how the shelter house began," explained Tracy as they resumed walking. "The name is a tribute to her and to so many others who couldn't escape, so that we never forget what's at stake." Sarah felt a lump in her throat. The letter she had found wasn't just a cry for help. It was a legacy, a testimony that even years later continued to save lives. "But you succeeded, Sarah," continued Tracy, lightly squeezing her shoulder. "You broke the cycle, and with your help, we can save others." When they finally reached the main road, a vehicle was waiting with the engine running. The back door opened, revealing Mrs. Thompson's familiar face. "Come on, my child," called the lady, extending her hand. "You did it." Sarah hesitated for just a second, looking back at the river. That now seemed like a guardian separating her from her past. Moses stood beside her, gently pushing her knee as if encouraging her to take the final step. "Can he come too?" she asked, caressing the goat's wet coat. "Of course he can," responded Mrs. Thompson with a smile. "He was always more than an animal, wasn't he? He was your protector, your friend, your courage when you thought you had none." Sarah entered the car, settling into the seat, while Moses jumped into the adapted cargo compartment. When the vehicle started, taking her away from Willow Creek Ranch, away from Frank, away from the fear that had imprisoned her for so many years, Sarah finally allowed herself to cry. They weren't tears of sadness or fear. They were tears of relief, of liberation, of hope. Through the fogged window, she observed the sky that was beginning to clear. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed, renewed world, the world that now awaited her with all its possibilities. "Where are we going?" she asked, drying her tears with the back of her hand. "To a safe place first," responded Tracy from the front seat. "Then, wherever you want. Life is yours now, Sarah. Yours to decide, yours to live." In the cargo compartment, Moses rested, peacefully, his wise eyes half closed as if finally he could relax his eternal vigilance. His work was complete. The journey beyond the river, beyond fear, beyond the limitations imposed by fate and by men, had just begun. And under the sky that opened in promises of a new day, Sarah knew that no matter what the future held, she